Hi folks. I'm going to start making ciabatta. I like using ciabatta especially for teaching people that are new to making bread because it's quick, it's quite simple, and it's probably the best bread for showing new people to bread making how the bread and the dough work over an extended period of time, particularly once you've got the bread dough all mixed up and you're working the dough to develop the gluten. Ciabatta makes it real clear how that gluten is working, because the dough changes very, very dramatically from being very, very loose at the beginning to, by the time you've worked the dough to an acceptable place where you can let it rise, it is so much more plastic and easy to work with, holds together really well. So you can really get a real good sense of how the bread is behaving over the stages of developing it into loaves of bread. A lot of the sourdough breads, especially the heavier breads, it's a lot trickier to get a good feel for how the bread is developing. So this one is, ciabatta is really good for that. The ingredients can be very, very simple. You can make this at home. This is a yeasted bread. I use a commercial yeast for this. And for initially anybody starting, especially at home, this is a really simple way of doing it. Once you've introduced trying to maintain a sourdough leaven, it becomes a lot more complicated. People can do it for a while, but then the leaven itself, it's a household pet. I've seen lots of people describe it that way, and I certainly do. You have to feed it in the morning and you have to feed it at night, and you have to keep it alive over an extended period of time. It's not something that you can stick in the freezer and pull out at your convenience. It's a living organism that you have to work with. And that becomes awkward for people who are just doing a few loaves every once in a while at home. For me here in my bakery, keeping a leaven alive is it's just sensible for me to do that. So I will show on the screen the quantities of the flour and water and yeast that I'm using, and what I'm doing right now is just making the biga, which is a good portion of the bread recipe, and this I do a day ahead of time so that it works up well. So I have some water, it's warm water, flour, and yeast. Now the yeast is the tricky part here. For a biga, you need a really, really small amount of yeast. So small that you can't actually accurately measure it dry. So this is an eighth of a teaspoon. So that's not very much, but I actually only need a fraction of that. And this is active dry yeast, and it becomes really difficult to try and measure accurately from the dry ingredients. So what you do is you actually expand a small amount of dry yeast in some water, and then it becomes easier to measure. So this is a half a cup of warm water. I use 1/8 of a teaspoon of dry active yeast, and I let it soak so it's dissolved in the water. And then this, I'm making 8 loaves of bread, and I need 1.5 teaspoons of this liquid in my water for this amount of bread. That's it. The rest of that is waste. Now, for my purposes, what I'm doing is I have a combination of flours here. That'll be in, you'll see that in the list. You don't have to do it this way. You can do a straight flour. Now, with a ciabatta, you need a fine grind or a light flour. That's one of the designations for flour that has been ground very, very fine. That doesn't mean it's a diet thing. It's just a fine grain. A light flour is one that's been ground really, really, really fine, like an all-purpose flour. You need a hard wheat because you want good, strong gluten strands to hold this together, because the ciabatta itself is a very light, bubbly on the inside bread with a nice crust, and the insides are nice and chewy. So in my case, I have a fine grind of hard wheat. I have spelt, and then a little bit of whole wheat and a little bit of rye. Those are mostly for flavor and a little bit of texture. As I said, though, this could be strictly just all-purpose, and it'll work out just fine. So I have my water and the flour, and this is going to make a very, very stiff dough. And once I have this worked up, it's just going to sit in the bowl now until tomorrow, when I'll add it to the rest of the ingredients to make up my batch of bread. As I said, 8 loaves of bread in this case. As I said, this is a very dry, stiff batch of flour and water. I use the baker's percentage when I'm developing these recipes. That makes it easier to expand and make a smaller batch if I need to. And what you'll see from the ingredients is that it's quite a low hydration, a low amount of water for the amount of flour. So it's roughly 50% for the biga. Now, when we get to the actual ciabatta itself, it's a very high hydration, meaning that there's a lot of water in relationship to the main ingredient, which is the flour. Now I'm not all I'm doing here is just working in the flour, consolidating it into one ball of dough. I'm not worrying about developing the gluten or anything. This isn't going to be, by itself, this isn't going to turn into loaves of bread. That's tomorrow. So in this case, one of the other advantages of using this type of bread as a starting lesson, most of the steps are more or less the same as with the sourdough bread. With the sourdough bread, I'm making up some portion of a batch of bread the day before, letting it ferment, and then adding that to the rest of the ingredients the following day. Same thing here. So, it's more or less all consolidated. Put it in a bowl with a lid. Wrong size. Then that gets stuck in a nice warm place, and it'll be ready tomorrow about the same time. It's about 11 o'clock in the morning. That's when I'll start making the batch of bread to be baked tomorrow evening.